There's a moment in every story where the language changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and permanently. A story that once sounded like help begins to sound like structure. A situation that once looked like compassion begins to look like arrangement. And in this case, that shift appears inside a single document. A contract. Because contracts do something that conversations cannot. They remove ambiguity. They take intention and translate it into obligation. They take promises and convert them into terms. And once something is written down, it no longer belongs to interpretation alone. It belongs to structure. So the question is not simply what this contract says. The question is what it reveals. Not just about money, but about control. Not just about participation, but about position. And most importantly, who was placed at the center and who was placed at the edge. Now consider the structure as it appears. The agreement, at its surface, divides everything into thirds. That sounds balanced. 3 equal parts. But balance in appearance is not the same as balance in function, because those thirds are not distributed evenly among individuals. 2 of those thirds belong to 2 individuals, and the remaining third is shared. Shared by the very people whose lives, identities, and circumstances form the foundation of the entire arrangement. That is where the structure begins to reveal itself. Because without the Whittaker family, there is no content. There is no platform, no audience, no engagement. Everything begins with them. And yet, within the structure of the agreement, they receive the smallest share. Not individually, collectively. That is not a detail. That is a design. Now pause there, because this is where interpretation must slow down. The question is not whether contracts can distribute value unevenly. They can. The question is whether the distribution reflects contribution. And that is where the imbalance becomes difficult to ignore. Because contribution here is not abstract. It is total. The Whittaker family is not a part of the content. They are the content. Every image, every video, every interaction is built on their presence. And yet the structure treats that presence as something that can be grouped, compressed, and divided. Not individually recognized, but collectively assigned. Now consider what is not present. Because absence, in documents like this, can be as revealing as inclusion. Certain members of the family are not mentioned, not formally recognized within the agreement, not defined within the structure. And that raises a quiet but important question. If they are part of what is being recorded, documented, and shared, but not part of the agreement itself, then where do they exist within this structure? Outside of it, or within it, without recognition? Because if someone is present in the outcome, but absent in the agreement, then their position is undefined. And undefined positions are vulnerable. Now move to another layer. Responsibility. Because contracts do not only divide profit, they assign roles. They define who creates, who manages, who directs. And in this case, the structure appears to place one individual in a position of overarching control. Creation of platforms, supervision of operations, direction of tasks. That concentration of responsibility creates a hierarchy, not a collaboration of equals, but a system with a center. And once a center exists, everything else organizes around it, which leads to a simple but critical question. If control is centralized, where does accountability go when something fails? Does it distribute evenly, or does it follow the same structure as control? Because in most systems, control and accountability are linked. The one who directs is the one who answers, at least in principle, but principle and reality do not always align. Now consider the second role: management of day-to-day operations, execution of tasks, following direction. This position appears active, but not autonomous. Operational. but not decisive. And that distinction matters, because when something goes wrong, the difference between executing and directing becomes significant. One carries instruction, the other defines it. And when responsibility is examined, that distinction is often revisited. Now step back, because at this point, the contract is no longer just a document. It is a map of relationships, of power, of access, of control. And maps reveal more than routes. They reveal priorities. What is centered, what is peripheral, what is fixed, and what is flexible. And in this map, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The Whittaker family, while central to the content, is not central to the structure. They are the foundation, but not the decision-makers. The subjects, but not the controllers. And that creates a separation between presence and power. Now consider another layer, consent, because contracts imply agreement. They suggest that all parties understood, accepted, and entered willingly. But understanding is not uniform. Capacity varies. Context matters. And when one party operates within a system they are familiar with, while another does not, the meaning of agreement becomes more complex. Not invalid, but not equal. And that complexity cannot be ignored, because a signature does not automatically resolve imbalance. It only formalizes it. Now return to the central question. Was this structure designed to help, or to organize benefit? Because those two goals can overlap, but they are not the same. Helping prioritizes outcome for the vulnerable. Organizing benefit prioritizes distribution among participants. And the difference between those two intentions becomes visible in structure, not in words, but in design. Now consider what is missing again. There is no clear indication, at least within what is visible, of long-term provision. No defined commitment to improving living conditions. No structured allocation towards stability beyond the content itself. And that absence is not minor, because if the stated purpose, publicly, was improvement, then the structure would be expected to reflect that, not as a promise, but as a mechanism. And if the mechanism is not present, then the intention becomes difficult to verify. Now step forward, because this document does not exist in isolation. It exists within a larger sequence of events. Events that led to outcomes that affected real people. And those outcomes are now being compared, not to what was said, but to what was written. Because when a contract appears, it reframes everything that came before it. Statements become commitments. Intentions become obligations. And questions become sharper. Not, what did they mean? But, what did they agree to? And that shift changes the entire discussion, because it removes interpretation and replaces it with structure. Now the story is no longer about perception. It is about alignment. Does the outcome align with the agreement? Does the structure reflect the result? And if not, where does that misalignment come from? Because misalignment does not appear randomly. It emerges from design, execution, or both. And identifying which one matters. Because one suggests error, the other suggests intention. And that distinction is where the story begins to change. Not through accusation, but through examination of what was built, of how it was built, and of who it ultimately served. If Part 1 examined the structure of the contract, then Part 2 must examine something more difficult. Function. Because a contract is not judged only by what it says. It is judged by what it produces. And sometimes, what it produces reveals more than what it promises. Now consider the stated purpose. A business venture. Creation and management of social media platforms. Distribution of content. Growth across multiple channels. At a surface level, that sounds organized, professional, even necessary, given the scale that attention can reach online. But structure alone does not define fairness. It only defines process. So the question becomes, who benefits from that process and how? Because function reveals priority, and priority reveals intention. Now look again at the division. 3 equal portions. But those portions are not equal in effect. 2 individuals receive direct thirds. The Whittaker family receives 1/3, shared, not allocated per person, not defined per contribution, but grouped. And grouping reduces value, because it compresses multiple individuals into a single share. That is not a neutral decision. It is a structural choice. Now consider the implications of that choice. Every piece of content, every video, every image, every interaction originates from the family, not from planning, not from production, from presence. Their lives are the source, and yet the system treats that source as a unit rather than as individuals. That creates a distance between what generates value and what receives it. Now pause, because this is where a common argument appears, that the other participants are providing services, filming, editing, publishing, managing platforms, and that those services justify their share. That argument is not unreasonable, but it must be examined carefully, because services support content. They do not replace it, and without the underlying content, the services have nothing to operate on. So the balance must reflect both contribution of labor and contribution of source. If one outweighs the other disproportionately, the system shifts from collaboration to extraction. Now consider another detail: control over platforms, creation of accounts, ownership of channels, supervision of operations. These are not small responsibilities. They define access. Who can post? Who can remove? Who can monetize? Who can control visibility? And control over platforms often translates into control over revenue, because revenue flows through the system that hosts the content. So whoever controls that system controls the flow. That is not speculation. That is structure. Now ask a simple question. If the Whittaker family does not control the platforms that carry their content, then where is their control located? Is it in the contract? Is it in oversight? Or is it dependent on the actions of others? Because if control is external, then dependence increases. And dependence, without safeguards, introduces risk. Now examine the role of direction. One party guiding tasks, another executing them. This creates a hierarchy of decision-making. And hierarchies are not inherently wrong. They exist in many systems, but they require accountability. Because when decisions are centralized, consequences must be as well. Otherwise, the structure becomes unbalanced. Control without accountability is not management. It is dominance. Now consider what happens when execution follows direction. If instructions are given and followed, and outcomes are negative, where does responsibility go? To the one who acted, or to the one who instructed? In practice, it often becomes contested. But in principle, direction carries weight, because execution operates within the boundaries set by direction, and those boundaries define outcome. Now bring this back to function. What did this structure produce? Did it create stability? Did it improve living conditions? Did it provide long-term security? Or did it primarily generate content? Because those are different outcomes. Content generation benefits the platform. Stability benefits the family. And if one is achieved while the other is not, the imbalance becomes visible. Now consider another layer: time. Because agreements like this are not static. They operate over time. And over time, small imbalances can become large ones. If revenue accumulates, but distribution does not adjust, the gap widens. If control remains centralized, but oversight does not increase, the risk grows. And if the people at the center of the content do not have increasing protection as exposure grows, Then vulnerability expands. Now ask another question. Were there mechanisms in place to adjust the structure as the situation evolved? To account for growth? To protect against misuse? To ensure transparency? Because without those mechanisms, a system can function, but not fairly. Now consider the absence of legal representation. Because contracts, especially those involving vulnerable individuals, are expected to include independent advice, not as a formality, but as protection. Protection against misunderstanding. Protection against imbalance. Protection against unintended consequences. And if that layer is missing, then the agreement exists without a critical safeguard. Which raises a difficult question. Was the agreement understood equally by all parties? Not signed. Understood. Because understanding requires context. It requires familiarity with terms, implications, and long-term effects. And without that, agreement becomes incomplete. Now move to another point. Purpose. What was the stated goal beyond content? Was there a defined plan to improve housing, to provide care, to create long-term security? If so, where is it reflected in the structure? Because purpose must be translated into action, and action must be supported by mechanism. Without mechanism, purpose remains intention. And intention, without execution, does not change outcome. Now consider what happens when expectation meets reality. The expectation was improvement. The reality appears to be different. That gap creates scrutiny, because when outcomes do not align with expectations, people begin looking for reasons. And those reasons often lead back to structure, not to isolated actions, but to the system that allowed those actions. Now examine the broader implication. This contract is not just a document between individuals. It is a representation of how value was defined, how roles were assigned, how control was distributed, and how benefit was allocated. And when those elements are examined together, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern where the source of value is separated from control of value, where participation does not equal authority, where presence does not guarantee protection. And that pattern is not unique to this case. It appears in many situations where vulnerable individuals intersect with systems they do not fully control. But that does not make it acceptable. It makes it recognizable. Now return to the central point. Function. What did this structure actually do? It created content. It created platforms. It created visibility. But did it create security? Did it create stability? Did it create protection? If the answer to those questions is uncertain, then the function is incomplete, because the purpose, as understood publicly, was not only to show, it was to improve. And improvement requires more than exposure. It requires structure aligned with outcome. Now consider the final layer, consequence. Because when a structure produces imbalance, consequence follows. Not always immediately, but eventually, through scrutiny, through investigation, through public examination. And that is where the situation now appears to be moving. From what was said, to what was written, from what was written, to what was done, and from what was done, to what can be proven. Because at the end of all systems, there is a point where intention is no longer the focus. Outcome is. An outcome, unlike intention, does not require interpretation. It requires explanation. And that explanation begins with structure, not as theory, but as evidence of how everything was designed to work, and whether it ever truly did. If Part 2 examined how the contract functioned, then Part 3 moves into something even more difficult to measure. Impact. Because structure explains design. Function explains operation. But impact explains consequence. And consequence is where everything becomes real. Not in documents, not in agreements, but in what happened to the people at the center of it. Now consider the Whittaker family again, not as participants in a contract, but as individuals living inside the results of that contract. Because contracts do not exist in isolation. They move outward. They influence decisions. They shape actions. They create conditions. And those conditions affect lives. So the question becomes, what changed? Not in theory. In reality, did their environment improve? Did their daily life become more stable? Did their access to care increase? Or did something else happen? Because impact cannot be evaluated through intention. It must be observed through outcome. Now look at the sequence. Exposure increased. Attention grew. More people became aware of the family. And with awareness came opportunity. Donations. Support. Offers of help. At least, in theory. Because attention often creates a surge of possibility. But possibility is not the same as delivery. And that distinction is where many situations begin to fracture. Now consider what followed. Questions. About money. About distribution. About what was actually reaching the family. Because when attention generates value, transparency becomes essential. Without it, trust begins to weaken. And once trust weakens, everything built on it becomes unstable. Now ask a simple question. If value was being generated from the family's presence, how much of that value reached them directly? Not in general terms, not in assumptions, but in measurable outcome. Because impact requires evidence, not of what could have happened, but of what did. And when that evidence is unclear, uncertainty expands. Now consider another effect. Intervention. Because increased visibility often attracts oversight. From the public, from institutions, from individuals who believe something needs to change. And sometimes that oversight is beneficial. It identifies risk. It introduces support. It creates structure where there was none. But sometimes it disrupts. Because intervention does not always align with the needs of the people involved. It aligns with systems, regulations, standards, processes, and those systems operate differently than individual lives. Now examine the result. The family was no longer in the same position they had been for decades. Changes occurred. Separation, relocation, adjustment to environments that were not familiar. And that shift is critical, because regardless of intention, the outcome was transformation. Their lives were altered, not gradually, but rapidly. And rapid change introduces instability, even when the change is meant to improve conditions. Now consider the psychological dimension, because stability is not only physical, it is emotional, routine, familiarity, connection. These are not small factors. They are foundational. And when they are disrupted, even for reasons that appear justified, the impact can be significant. Now ask another question. Was that impact accounted for? Not in theory. In planning. Was there a structured transition? A gradual adjustment? Or was the change abrupt? Because the way change is introduced determines how it is experienced. Now return to the contract. Because while it may not directly outline these outcomes, it contributed to the conditions that allowed them to occur. It created visibility. It created attention. It created a situation where outside systems became involved. And once those systems entered, control shifted again. From individuals to institutions. And institutional control operates differently. It prioritizes compliance, safety, regulation, but it does not always prioritize familiarity or autonomy. Now consider autonomy, because this is where the conversation becomes most complex. The Whittaker family lived a certain way for decades. Not conventional, not structured by modern standards, but consistent. And consistency creates its own form of stability. Now that stability has been disrupted, and the question becomes, was it replaced with something better? Not in principle, in experience, because improvement cannot be defined externally alone. It must be felt internally, and that is difficult to measure. Now consider the absence of a voice. Because throughout this entire situation, one thing remains limited. Direct, consistent input from the family themselves. What they prefer, what they understand, what they want. And without that, interpretation fills the gap. Others speak on their behalf. Others define what is best. And while that may come from intention, it still creates distance between the people making decisions and the people living with them. Now examine another consequence. Fragmentation. The family, once living together, is now divided. Not entirely, but significantly. And division changes everything. Support systems shift. Relationships adjust. Daily interactions are altered. And even if those changes are intended to provide care, they still represent loss. Loss of proximity, loss of routine, loss of the familiar structure that defined their lives. Now ask, was that loss considered in the original structure? Was it anticipated? Or did it emerge as an unintended consequence? Because unintended consequences are often the most revealing. They show what was not accounted for. Now consider the broader impact, not just on the family, but on perception. Because once a situation like this unfolds, it becomes a reference point for future cases, for public understanding, for how similar situations are approached. And if the outcome appears misaligned with the original intention, it raises questions beyond this single case. Questions about responsibility, about oversight, about how vulnerable individuals are integrated into systems of visibility and monetization. Now return to the central idea. Impact. Because at the end of all analysis, impact is the only measure that cannot be abstracted. It is visible in where people are, in how they are living, in what has changed, and in what has been lost. Now consider the final layer of this part. Accountability through outcome. Not through blame, but through result. Because even if intentions were mixed, even if actions were complex, even if responsibility is shared, the outcome remains singular, the family's current condition. And that condition becomes the reference point for evaluating everything that came before it. Not what was said, not what was planned, but what happened. And if that outcome does not reflect the level of benefit that was expected, then the structure, the function, and the execution must all be re-examined. Not to assign immediate judgment, but to understand how the path led here. Because understanding that path is the only way to determine whether what occurred was failure or design that never aligned with its stated purpose. And that distinction is where the story begins to move from observation to accountability. By this stage, the discussion is no longer about what was promised or even how the contract was structured. It is about what remains after everything unfolded. Because once impact becomes visible, the story changes again. It moves from intention to consequence, and consequence is harder to argue with. Now consider where things stand. A contract existed. Roles were defined. Control was centralized. Value was generated. But the outcome, the lived reality of the Whittaker family, does not clearly reflect the stability or security that would justify the structure. And that creates a fracture, not in theory, in alignment. Because if a system is built around a vulnerable group, then the measure of that system is simple. Did it improve their position? Not slightly, not temporarily, but meaningfully. Now examine what complicates that question. Multiple layers of involvement. Different individuals making different decisions at different times. Actions that overlap, influence, and sometimes contradict each other. This makes accountability difficult to isolate, because responsibility is not always singular. It can be shared, distributed, and uneven. But uneven does not mean unclear, because even in complex systems, patterns emerge. Who had control? Who made decisions? Who benefited? Who did not? And those patterns create direction. Now consider another critical point. Narrative versus documentation. Public conversations often focus on what people believe happened, but documentation focuses on what can be shown. And those two do not always match. Because belief is shaped by perception, documentation is shaped by proof. So when the situation moves forward toward any form of resolution, it will not be guided by narrative. It will be guided by what can be demonstrated. And that may not satisfy everyone, because people are not only reacting to evidence, they are reacting to outcome. Now return to the Whittaker family, because at the center of all of this, their position is unchanged in one key way. They are still the reference point, not the contract, not the creators, the family, and their current condition becomes the final measure. If they are safer, more stable, more supported, then the system can argue justification. If they are not, then the structure, regardless of intention, becomes questionable. And that is where the story narrows. Not to who said what, but to what actually changed. Because in the end, contracts can explain structure, but they cannot justify outcome. Only results can do that. And results, once visible, are difficult to reinterpret. They either reflect the promise, or they expose the gap between what was built and what was needed.